Just for structure for today's call, welcome and introductions, and then we'll hear from Jason Willis and Sean Tanner at WestEd, and then we'll hear from Mike Griffith at Learning Policy Institute, and then I'm going to go over just some of the resources that we've been pulling together for for legislators and legislative staff. So there is a couple things to keep in mind with these Zoom meetings that we'd like to have you use your video if you can, so we can feel more like it's an actual meeting, and mute your audio if you can. So, you probably just heard my wife calling my dog, kind of stuff. And there's also the option to raise your hand if you have a question, and that will show up in the chat box. And also please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat box. And unless you're have something to share, don't share your screen. No Zoom bombing, please. And we're going to record this and have it available for everyone else. And we'll send out the link to all the other fellows for this as well. So I'm going to have Jason and Sean introduce themselves. They are Ed Finance researchers and experts extraordinaire, along with Mike. And let's go ahead and turn it over to, well, actually, sorry, I forgot these. One of the resources before we start is the Ed Finance Fellows webpage. Here you can access this link, and then there's a link to all the other presentations and meetings that we've had up until now. And there's a lot of good resources on those. So let's just jump right into it. And Sean and Jason, thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Let me get the PowerPoint deck up here. Thanks so much for having us today, and I'm excited to get a chance to, as I move you guys all over onto a different screen so I can see you, the chance to talk with you all a little bit about one of the topics that WestEd's been doing some investigation into around kind of fair and equitable reductions to state education budgets. Before we get too further in, Sean, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sean Tanner. I'm a senior research associate at WestEd. Study things like school accountability, school finance, and the economics of education. And grateful for this opportunity to give everyone a 5-minute econ lesson today.
And I'm Jason Willis, a colleague of Sean's at WestEd, and director of strategy and performance with the agency. Similarly, do a lot of work around school finance, systems improvement topics with states and school districts. A little bit different from Sean, but still in the space of having formerly been a practitioner in school districts, now advising states on kind of a lot of those implications. And excited today to kind of share, I think, exactly what Sean said, which is using what we know about kind of evidence and research to really inform some of the key questions that we know you all as state policymakers and leaders are wrestling with. As we were just kind of getting into the call, when you throw out numbers like a 20% or a 25% reduction in a state's general fund, it is a breathtaking number. And the strategies and the ability to be able to use policy levers to mitigate that terrible circumstance, given this economic recession we're now in, is really important. And so we think that at WestEd, it's important to consider evidence and research on a number of these different topics that are kind of facing states in the moment. And so we have kind of a structure of some policy briefs that we're putting together. We're talking about one of those today on fair and equitable reductions to state education budgets. Here are the kind of 4 other topics we've got lined up across the summer months into July and August, really focusing on thinking about creating flexibility in education funding. So what's commonly referred to as categorical programs, and what the evidence and research speaks to on that. Second, around special education funding, given such strong kind of legal and regulatory protections for special ed funding, there's still a lot to think about there in terms of maintenance of effort provisions and ways in which that funding can be leveraged in such tight fiscal times. Obviously, the use of cash, reserves, cash deferrals is a really big topic and something that is kind of lesser known in this space, but is definitely a way that states and school districts can kind of manage through a crisis. And then this final one around revenue strategies to support education prioritization. So, we talk a lot about what to do on the expenditure side of the house, which is important to kind of get in line with, where revenues are headed, but also thinking on the revenue side of the ledger, how do you think about prioritizing education, both in critical moments like this, but also over the longer term? So today, Sean and I are going to talk a bit about this kind of fair and equitable reductions to state education budgets. I'm going to kind of tee up the conversation. As Sean foreshadowed, we're going to do a little bit of kind of review on the research, and we'll close with some key considerations and then take some Q&A from you all to kind of engage in the conversation, and then we'll wrap up from there. So one of the kind of important and kind of key topics, and one of the reference points here to think about is most recently from the Great Recession. And in that moment, we had a fairly large investment through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that was the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. And understanding what that did and what it didn't do in terms of support to public education, we think is basically this is a lesson to be learned as state legislatures, other decision makers head into decision making in the coming months about their budget. So one of the first things that we want to identify is like the things that actually worked, what the SFSF did was stabilize state and local education employment by supplementing revenue in the FY 10-11 year. We did see revenue begin to decline after that infusion of federal dollars were put in. That was an observed effect that we saw afterwards as those federal dollars were removed from budgets. It did generate the kind of GDP growth that was expected between 1/2 to 2.4 times the investment of both state and local transfers, including the Race to the Top funds and the I3 funds. And one of the big lessons for states, as all of you probably have become familiar with, is that states really kind of built reserves over the subsequent decade that actually is going to help us in this very recession. On the other side of the coin, in terms of things that it was unable to do for us, was I think the point that we're really talking about today, is that it exacerbated funding inequities among school districts and schools that were caused by two effects that Sean's going to go into some more detail about. The first is the kind of sharp decline in state revenue for high need districts that was also and that helped to then buoy well-off districts by increases in their kind of millage rates for property taxes. So you saw this effect as state funding formulas have progressively moved to be supported more on state funds, that the larger proportions of those funds are basically going to higher need communities, which is what they're intended to do, and that is the right way to think about it. But in a declining circumstance, when we think about that, how we kind of draw back those funds should be kind of considerate of the needs of those communities as a result. And overall, what we saw across the Great Recession is that states' approaches to those reductions didn't take that into account, thereby us seeing like sharper declines in state revenue for higher need districts. And that for those local communities that could afford it, right, they could implement increases in their millage rates around property tax. They basically would help to offset any of the declines that they would have otherwise seen from state aid as a result. And so it was this key point that kind of we built around this first topic. I think the last point I'll make here around what didn't happen during the Great Recession was some of the restructuring around major long-term obligations. So think about like pension or long-term healthcare obligations. And this has been an issue that has been a bit in the background over the course of the last decade or two, but we think is a contributor to the discussion about how best to think about education aid in the U.S. So with that setup, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, and Sean, take us away.
Great. Okay. So thanks, Jason. I'm just going to talk through two issues that get raised when you start thinking about making cuts to education and you want to do it fairly. What may seem as a fair thing to do is just reduce across the board, across all districts equally. But there are these issues that get raised about what impact that actually has on students and districts. So one, and the first that I'm going to introduce, excuse me, is the issue of diminishing marginal returns to investments in education, right? So it's standard econ theory and with some empirical social science support out in the education finance literature is that if you can imagine, and here this is just a hypothetical relationship that I've created here to illustrate the point, a level of child's resources is on the x-axis, right? And it can be literal per pupil revenue from the state, it can be family resources, it can be a child's innate cognitive ability, neighborhood quality, whatever you want to think of as the basket of resources that impacts test scores and student achievement, right? Level of resources on the x-axis, test score on the y-axis. And that curved line is illustrating diminishing marginal returns. And I'm sorry if some of you have recently been through econ or if this is obvious, but it's worth focusing on is that a kid that has a higher level of resources, when they get additional resources or when they get some of those resources taken away, the test score impact is going to be much more muted than it would be for a child with low resources to get an equivalent level of resources given or taken away. The test score impact is much greater. Okay, so that's just the basic idea. I'm going to spend like 3 minutes talking about that. So Jason, if you could advance one slide. Okay, so here we go. So the dashed green lines, right? So let's say a kid has 85 units of resources. The scale is not important, right? So a lot of resources, that is associated with the test score of about 98, right? So that's just somebody that has a high level of resources. They're doing really well on the test. And one more slide, please. So if we give that person, we go from 85 to 95 on the resource scale, just 10 of these arbitrary units of resources. The consequent test score increase on the y-axis is small. It's there. Giving a kid more resources will increase their test score, but not by much, right? So what we're going to see in the next slide is the change of an equivalent number of resource units, 10, but from 25 to 35 instead of 85 to 95. And there, the test score consequence is much larger. And so this is just illustrating what diminishing marginal returns are, right? And so if you take 10 units of resources away from both of these kids, one will be much more negatively impacted than the other, okay? Now, we lack the specificity to tell you exactly which students in exactly which context this applies to. Your local knowledge is going to have to dictate that. It could be that a district is particularly hard hit from the COVID pandemic. There could be an opioid crisis in the region. You could have a district with a lot of English language learners that need an additional boost to be proficient on test scores. So that we can't tell you, but we can just frame the conversation this way about the people, the kids that have more feel it less when you take something away from them. So that's just one. And Jason, if you could advance the slide. And there's a lot of text that you can read in the brief, but this just reinforcing the same point. And then if you could advance the next slide. Okay. So that's the student level impact of changes in resources. Whether you have a lot of resources or a little, the test score impact is going to be different on the student. Whether resources decline or increase in a district when the state actually pulls funding away is also reliant on that district's ability to raise funds locally, primarily through property taxes, okay? So the x-axis here is just local revenue capacity, the ability of a district to compensate for losses from the state. It goes from 0 to 1,000. The y-axis is the overall revenue loss that a district will feel when the state pulls back $1,000 per pupil. Okay, so the top of that is 0, because if you could be totally compensated for that with local revenue, and the bottom is negative 1,000. You could feel 100% of the state's pullback, right? This very simple straight line with 2 arrows is just meant to reinforce wealthy districts with higher capacity to compensate. Those kids won't feel the difference, won't feel the pullback from the state, but for a few $100s per pupil. Whereas poorer districts with lower local capacity will feel the brunt of the state's disinvestment, right? And so not only is there differences in students and how they respond to educational resources, but the change in their educational resources is dependent on how successfully their district can compensate for state's decrease in local revenue. And so Jason, if you could advance the slide. And this is just text to reinforce that point. So again, what may seem like a fair way to enact cuts, and cuts are going to be needed, will be to, across the board, reduce it equally. But there are these issues that you should think about and weigh when you're thinking about doing that. And I'll toss it back to Jason.
Yeah, so thanks, Sean, for laying that out. So when we think about these like 2 really kind of well-researched, well-established phenomenon, particularly in public policy, there's kind of 3 considerations that we would offer to states. The first is really kind of speaking to maintaining the spending level for students with greatest needs. So when you're thinking about the implementation of those sets of cuts, and part of this will also infer the way in which you've designed the system that you currently have for funding students in your state. So if for example, the mechanism by which you are funding students already emphasizes a tremendous amount of that funding going to those students of higher need, it's probably not going to be a good idea to apply across the board cuts in thinking about drawing back those resources, because you're going to take by volume a lot more resources away from those dollars that you would intended to support. That also plays a mixture in terms of the different categorical programs that you might set up or design, and which also create some really good natural boundaries to potentially avoid. So if you've got sets of programs that are already directed towards low income or EL or other types of vulnerable populations, thinking first about the protection of those programs rather than, again, across the board cuts is really, really considerate. And the second, which is really akin to the first, is that when you're thinking about where that state aid is flowing, that understanding that you have some communities that have the ability to raise the local tax base, and evidence to suggest that that's exactly what happened during the Great Recession. You had those very communities that came in, they knew they had the wealth or the income to basically supplement the reduction in state aid, and they did it, that it's likely to happen again as a result of this type of an economic downturn. I think third and finally is also, and this is a hard gauge, is thinking about, what will be the length of this economic recession, right? If you knew that it was only a 1-year recession versus a 5-year, right? You're probably going to be acting really differently in a 1-year versus a 5-year approach. I think what we have seen, certainly the data would suggest to us, that we're probably talking about somewhere between a 2 to 3 year economic recession. And so that consideration is going to be really important in thinking about how you achieve this degree of reductions. And again, in the frame of the different topics that we're addressing in the policy brief series, this is one mechanism, but it is a big one that state legislatures and governors are using in order to achieve that balanced budget as a result of those contracting revenue. So that's kind of sum up the 15 minutes that Sean and I had to present. And Dan, I'll throw it back to you and open it up for any other questions or comments that folks have about what we presented today.
Thanks a lot, Jason and Sean. I appreciate that graphic on the marginal diminishing returns. In terms of student learning, I had seen it expressed that way before. I know it's, I can conceive of it and have, in my own mind, know it's there, but this is really helpful to see that. Is there any questions that anyone has at the moment for Sean or Jason? If not, then we'll go ahead and throw it over to Mike Griffith at the Learning Policy Institute.
Did you have a question? You unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I guess what your presentation makes me think of, and I think about our funding formula in Montana as being incredibly complicated with a lot of levers and dials and gears and things. And the message seems to be, think hard about what gears and dials you're going to turn down, if you need to turn down in the next year or two, to make sure that you don't unintentionally negatively impact those kids and districts who are most vulnerable. Is that kind of
right? So there's the interaction of two issues here, is that students individually come with a basket of resources, and they are more or less vulnerable to reduction in education finance, right? So some kids, if they don't get, let's say, to take an arbitrary example, their music teacher has to be cut at school, their parents are going to be able to compensate with private music lessons. They're not going to be worse off in their educational life, right? Some kids won't have that. And then there are more severe cuts to, literacy education. So there's the student level. And then there's will the district actually feel the loss from the state pulling back investments? Some districts will be able to compensate. So no matter what the student level of resources within the district may or may not feel those losses depending on how they can compensate for it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One thing that was interesting too about the Great Recession, from the delivery of education, districts and most states were enacting huge reforms at that moment with the adoption of the Common Core state standards and the new assessments that were aligned to those. So a lot of districts were going through that work while also having less resources to do it. And I think that's something that's not really present right now. I don't think there's any big kind of curricular or assessment reforms going on right now from state to state, but that certainly, I think, made the delivery of education a little more difficult during the Great Recession. I just want to make that point. Mike is with Learning Policy Institute, our partner with the Education Finance Fellows, and I'll throw it over to you, Mike. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Sean and Jason, great job. I feel everything I'm going to say is redundant now because they did such a great job of explaining what's happening and how we can move forward with this.
I'm sure that's not going to be true at all, Mike.
Well, I need to make some stuff up to actually justify my being here. So yeah, I mean, everything they said was right on target. Everything we talked about, the downturn the last time lasted 5 years. We didn't anticipate that. We never kind of anticipate these things. So when you see what states were doing, was taking their federal dollars, using those along with one-time budget maneuvers, tapping reserve accounts to get them past the first 2 years of the downturn. When we really didn't hit bottom until around 2010, even though it started in 2008. What we know, and both Sean and Jason touched on this, is cuts impact all students, but the research has shown that the cuts during the Great Recession on education disproportionately impacted low-income students and students from minority communities. Just like they were saying, that's why we need to think about how can we do this in the future? How can we create a set of cuts that doesn't impact these students? And it's difficult. And Had was bringing it up. Some funding formulas are structured in such a way that it's difficult to get around them. In your own state, you might have a formula that does not allow you to make the kind of changes that you'd want to better target low-income students. Again, we know this difference between how reliant you are on state funding versus how reliant you are on local funding is huge. Low wealth communities tend to be more reliant on state funding, high wealth communities more on local funding. Local funding will remain stable, at least for the next year, but probably up to 3 years after the start of the recession. So that's where we'll continue to see that separation of haves and have-nots based on what is the general wealth in your community. The initial CARES funding is helping us right now, providing some assistance, but it's not the only answer. It's only about 2% of P-12 funding in the 50 states and a little less than $300 per pupil. And the rules say you can only use this funding for costs that are brought about by the virus. You cannot use it to fill budget holes, which I think surprised a lot of people at the time, but that's, what has happened. And to put it into perspective, it's about 1/5 the size of the package that was provided under the Recovery Act back in 2009. So much smaller. These are the things we're hearing. My guess is you're hearing all this too in your own states. But one of the biggest things I'm worried about now are how many districts will have the money available to open up for in-person learning in the fall. Between the budget cuts and the increased cost because of COVID-19, we're hearing from districts around the country that they just don't have the resources to open up on time. One of the other things you need to look at, in your own states is if schools are moving online full-time or part-time, can your funding formula handle that? How do you do student counts for your funding formula? Can you move the student counts to include online learning? If not, it's going to create a lot of financial problems for school districts out there. If your requirement right now in your funding formula is that students be present on a certain day or set of days in person, that's really going to impact the amount of funding they get. Again, when you're creating these budget cuts and budget adjustments, do they allow for equity between districts and student groups? And then one of the things we saw during the last recession is that there was a huge push for increased flexibility in spending. This idea makes sense, right? If the state's providing less, sort of the deal that they make to districts is we're going to give you greater flexibility on how you spend that. The idea itself is good unless it comes at the expense of underserved student populations. What I mean by that is, it's great if you have a program that provides after-school funding to help target low achieving students. And it's great if you allow for flexibility now because of COVID-19 and say, well, maybe it's not after school, but that's going to be summer school, or that's going to be weekend programs for kids to help them build up, be more flexible with it. But if you simply take that money and fold it back into the general fund and say, we're going to allow you to spend it as you will, it won't necessarily be targeted to those kids it was intended for. So you see some places like Minnesota who have recently decided to use their GEAR funding to actually supplement these programs. And they're going to have a summer program for students that is going to have a 6-to-1 student to teacher ratio so they can do distancing over the summer for these kids who need it the most. So it's this idea, allow the flexibility, but ensure that those funds are being spent where they need to. Just want to let you know some other stuff we have going on at LPI. We have a whole series about learning in a time of COVID-19 that covers a lot of different issues. But this one paper to me is incredibly interesting. It's some of my coworkers went through and looked at what other countries have done to open up schools and to keep in-person education going. And so in China, Denmark, Norway, Singapore, and Taiwan, what they're doing, which I think can be a guide for some of you in your own states about distance learning and blended learning and how it can actually work for students. And then something that Linda Darling-Hammond is pushed at our organization, which is this idea of this is a difficult time, but it's a time of opportunity too. When we're talking about funding systems not being able to be changed to help benefit low-income kids, maybe the thought is it's time for a new funding system. I know it sounds kind of crazy to want to do that during these difficult times. It's hard enough to put a new funding system in when you have a ton of money. But you have states like Rhode Island and Maryland that completely overhauled their system during down economic times. And what they saw as an advantage was you can take this now, you can change the system, and as the economy grows and new money comes in, you're growing the pot and raising all ships. And so they saw it as an opportunity to make these changes. There are 9 other ideas that are out there to talk about, rethinking things like assessment and accountability and other programs within education. So really interesting. And this is a briefing paper that Linda put out, but we're going to have a much larger paper expanding on each one of these ideas and how you can maybe make some major changes in policy now during these trying times. And here's my contact information. I think I know every one of you personally, so I think you probably have this already, but if not, feel free. This is my contact, and this is, again, the Learning in the Time of COVID-19 series that we have, which sounds a lot to me like Love in the Time of Cholera, which was a book that was out and a movie. Yeah, so I'd love to have answer some questions now, or just have an open conversation if you'd like.
Thanks a lot, Mike. And Mike's also been doing a lot of interesting research and work at LPI, most recently on the teaching positions and what the losses in teaching positions since the pandemic began. So yeah, check out Mike's work at the Learning in the Time of Cholera or COVID. But yeah, I think it would be great now if we can go around and if you have any further questions. Also, I'm curious, since we have our full contingent from Montana here, what you may be looking at as you go into session next year. And then also maybe hearing from you, Brita, and Eddie and Alicia in Wisconsin, what's on the docket for ed finance in your states. So I'll just turn it over for questions, and then if there are none, then Brita, can you share what you have? But first, let's any questions for Mike or any other questions for Jason and Sean? All right, Brita. What happened in Colorado last week?
Well, a lot of fun. Before I forget, I want to tell you though that our Craig Harper, our Joint Budget Committee education staffer, is going to be pushing hard on the inequity issues last year. And I had mentioned to him that during the 3 years of school finance funding formula interim committees we had that did not result in any changes to the formula, there was a presentation. I thought, Mike, you were there on the panel, it might not have been yours, about sort of the inequities that were created in Colorado during the last recession, so that there could be some discussion in the fall about how what we did last time created inequities, and we're doing essentially the same thing this time, and sort of trying to move the dial on the formula. We did not make any changes to our school finance formula. Under current statute, during the last recession, we ended up underfunding the formula by about $1 billion. We had worked our way down last in 1920 to having a budget stabilization or negative factor of about $572 million, which seemed like a great movement down. We ended up last week, or a little over a week ago, increasing that from 572 million to 1.18 billion. So that's a 14% cut to funding under the formula. So there was an effort, a very small effort, to change our cost of living factor, which attributes about $1 billion to the formula, whereas at risk and the other factors are more like 300 million. There was to help with the inequity issue, there was a 5% cut to the cost of living factor suggested, and that did not make it. So, so it was a pretty tough time. With respect to some of your comments, there was a big push by districts to freeze student count. We didn't recommend that because we think that it's important that if students move to rural districts, or if they end up living with grandparents, or if they move within the urban center to different districts, we certainly don't want to underfund the districts more than we already are for the kids they actually have. So it's possible if you have big movements out of one district, a decline in student count could also have a negative impact. We're going to wait and see what happens. We did protect some of the funding for students in greatest needs. There was $27 million in non-categorical ELL money that we could have used to, could have transferred that to the general fund to meet our state share, but we didn't. There was some special ed non-categorical money we could have used. We did rely on a lot of one-time transfers. Our reserve is down to nearly nothing, and we bet on the greater revenue forecast from the governor's office. So we're, and then there was a lot of talk about how the CARES money was really, we were really almost giving schools more because the governor allocated $510 million from the $1.6 billion in CARES money that we got to K-12 and $450 million to higher ed. But, you know, districts are saying, you know, that's not going to replace the loss to the general fund. So that's where we are. But I just wanted to let you know that the sort of inequities, the kind of doubling down on the problems we created last recession, is a topic that staff is looking into. So if I can send Craig Harper your way, he also might be interested in some of these webinars. I mean, this is exactly, all those topics are exactly what we're looking at.
Yeah, thanks, Brita. And I did read Craig Harper's memo on, I'm trying to remember exactly what, it was on the property tax. I can't remember what it was. Yeah, but he's,
a whole other issue is the problem with our property tax system and the various constitutional provisions that will not allow us to increase revenue by a single penny without a vote of the people, which is how we ended up. It was funny because through NCSL and other organizations, I got to talk to people during the last recession. And I remember talking to the people in Connecticut where they had said, I think they increased their sales tax for 2 years by 0.0001% and had sort of staved off some of these cuts to education, but we don't have any power to change either the mills or taxes to defray some of the additional $700 million hit to education this year. So.
Yeah. And just so everyone knows, Craig Harper works in the for the Joint Budget Committee. Yeah.
He's the K-12 education staffer for the Budget Committee.
Yeah. Thanks, Brita. Eddie, do you want to share a little bit what Kansas did over the last couple of months?
Yeah. So Kansas, as was the case for most places, suspended its legislative session mid-March, came back for a one-day sine die session May 21st, passed, 9 or 10 pieces of legislation in very rapid fashion on that day. To describe it as poorly vetted would be a bit of an understatement, I think. The governor responded by vetoing a number of those pieces of legislation, including probably most importantly, the one that included a number of items related to the pandemic response and calling a special session to be held. It was somewhat in the recent past, the days all run together, June 6th or something like that, I don't know. In a 2-day special session, the legislature passed a revised pandemic response sort of bill, and the governor had agreed to. The main 2 items of note in those pieces of legislation were the governor's emergency management authority, which had become embroiled in a lawsuit when she declared churches to be non-essential activities, and also the legislative oversight of the CARES Act, the CRF money, that they eventually got worked out. the legislature had passed a full but not nuanced, is maybe the best way to describe it, budget on its last day in session back in March before it suspended. So the entire state budget was passed. We revised our revenue estimates mid-April, and the revisions cut about $1.3 billion out of the combined FY20 and 21 revenue estimates, which we had been projected to have about a $650 million positive ending balance at the end of 21. Those revisions resulted in a negative $650 million ending balance. The State Finance Council, which is the governor and a handful of legislative leaders in Kansas that kind of manage cash flow more or less, is they're actually meeting right now, literally simultaneously with this meeting, to approve what in Kansas is referred to as a certificate of indebtedness. It's the way the state borrows its own idle funds from non-general fund revenues to cash flow the general fund, since, as is the case with most states with an income tax, our general fund tends to be back heavy in terms of its receipts. So they're meeting right now to discuss that. The legislators on that committee, I think, had made it clear to the governor that they weren't going to approve a certificate of indebtedness absent some sort of indication as to what her plans were as far as resolving that $650 million budget hole. So they are currently discussing that. And so I'm kind of missing that meeting to be on this. Obviously, our office has plenty of other people as a part of that meeting. So I wasn't actually sure what to anticipate from that. I'm trying to actually glance at it right now. And I'm not seeing a ton in the areas of education. There it is. Looks like 77 million of FY22 foundation aid for education. Now, I assume that's supposed to be FY21 though. But the one thing that is important to note for Kansas is that right now we are on a phased upward trajectory for school finance in response to lawsuits and legislation that came about as part of those lawsuits. So I anticipate most of the reductions for education basically be to just stop the planned increases for the current year. And so kind of the hope is that schools shouldn't see any actual reduction in state dollars. It's just that for at least the next couple of years, I anticipate that they won't maybe get any, or certainly not as much of the anticipated increase. And obviously there's probably going to be some kind of smaller categorical pieces. Since Kansas school finance is so litigation oriented and so tied up in litigation, the governor, kind of at the direction of the state board, or at least the advisement of the State Board of Education, was reported to be considering basically cutting all of the non-litigation oriented school spending. So our litigation relates to kind of our foundation formula, and then the very large scale capital equalization, capital outlay, state equalization aid, and things like that. I think the anticipation is that the governor will try to keep that as held harmless as possible, but all of those small categoricals that Kansas does still have, it's a really small share of the grand education funding. Those are not actually tied up in this litigation. And so I think there's kind of an anticipation that she might kind of zero out all of those, which would be a really sharp impact on all of those individual programs. But in terms of the grand delivery of education in Kansas, it's a relatively small piece. So, and I'm trying to follow along online to see exactly what those changes are, but impossible to follow both at once. So if this meeting was 2 hours later, I would have a lot more clear information to provide you all.
Well, we will be convening again, at least in August. Yeah. So we'll get it.
And Dan, I assume John Hess told you, for everybody else's benefit, John Hess actually took a job with the Kansas State Department of Education. He's their internal budget person now, as of 3.5 weeks ago. So it is back to being just me handling school finance in Kansas.
Well, I hope you get some help, because it's a busy time. So we've been tracking legislation on all legislation related to COVID-19. And I'm going to show you links to get to that legislation. But what we're seeing in terms of ed finance, it's just been a lot of cash transfers. A lot of enactments are just transferring some from one cash fund to another. It's what we're seeing. So it's kind of what Jason was referring to about our availability of these reserve funds and moving some of the cash around. And Jason also had a good question in the chat, and that is about how we're counting students for the purposes of the funding formula. And with moving to online situations or a hybrid of in-person, not in-person, or even a lot of movement, whether kids are going to live with grandma and grandpa or not, or transfers in and out of private school. If your states are considering your counts now, we're moving from if you're an average daily attendance or a one-day count day like Colorado, whether you're thinking about moving to more of like a membership count and having multiple count days throughout the year. Has that been on your radar at all?
So Kansas is already a kind of membership counting basis, not an attendance. And it is a one day, it's September 20th. And then for those districts that happen to have military installations on them or immediately adjacent to them, they get a second bite at the apple, so to speak, in February. So Kansas, if they are traditional virtual students, they won't be counted in that. But if they are not virtual students but happen to be doing a portion of their schooling virtually as a result of the pandemic, then they still would be counted on that. The term used in statute is regularly enrolled. And so if they are enrolled on September 20th, as if they would be going to class under normal circumstances, then physical class under normal circumstances, then they'll still be counted in terms of enrollment. In terms of the changing Kansas statute, actually, so this is actually not an immediate term issue for Kansas anyway, because Kansas does enrollment based upon prior year counts or the second preceding year. So for school districts that are declining, they always get to hold on to that. So their 2021 enrollment will be the greater of their 1920 September 20th enrollment or their 1819 September 20th enrollment. And so this is a long-term, it certainly might be something that we want to revisit whenever it comes time to consider the actual enrollment count on September 20th of 2020, but that's not a problem for the current the 21 session, and it very well might not even be a problem for the 22 session, but it's a long time horizon issue in Kansas.
Thanks, Eddie.
In Colorado, we do have some enrollment averaging, but the state board has the power to determine sort of what a full-time student looks like, what attendance looks like. So there was discussion about putting something in the School Finance Act to clarify that kids that were on a hybrid, we have the single count date, October 1st. So the idea was, what do we do? And it was determined that the state board had the power to determine whether someone was, whatever blended model they had still constituted, full-time enrollment. So I think we're just going with, we'll figure it out. But if you're still in the public school on that date, however they're providing their instruction, as long as their instruction complies with whatever the state law is, you'll get counted. So.
Yeah, I think that sounds right for both Brita and Ed, given the way you all count in Kansas and Colorado. There is a set of states, 7, that do attendance as a function of funding for schools. And then I think there's another dozen or so that will do daily membership counts. So based on the rules around that, thinking if they're like in a distance learning or they're in a hybrid type of environment, they might see further impacts. But I think that Ed and Brita, your comments, I think really help to kind of shed some light on this. May not be as big of an issue in some states as it's going to be in others, depending on how they count students.
Yeah. We are coming up on 1 o'clock in 7 minutes, or we're all in different time zones, but coming up on top of the hour, 7 minutes left. I want to just show some resources quickly. And then if anyone from Montana or Alicia, you'd like to share anything. then I'll open it up after that. But first, I do want to introduce Elizabeth Romanoff. She's our new intern at NCSL, so welcome. And she's going to be working on education finance and working to help support the fellowship. So she'll be an intern here for about a year, maybe more. So say hi. Would you like to say where you're going to school and what you're studying?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the intro, Dan. So my name is Elizabeth. I just completed my first year of graduate school at the University of Denver's Corbell School of International Studies. My concentration right now is in global finance, trade, and econ. So I'm really, really happy to get an internship that focuses on fundamentally a financial topic. I'm also interested in the accumulation of human capital, and education is the prime example of that, I think. So really excited by this opportunity, and yeah, I was vigorously taking notes. There's a lot to learn. So yeah, thank you all for your expertise.
Thanks. Okay, there is on NCSL's website, we're tracking reports from legislative budget offices, and we update this frequently. This is as of yesterday. So if you're looking what other states, what the cuts are looking like for, and these are general fund or other state fund revenues, not specifically for education. So feel free to visit here. Over the summer, we're going to try to figure out how education was or is being impacted by some of these cuts and try to dig into what it looks like for education. Then there's also I mentioned that we're tracking all the legislation. We have in this bill tracker over 2,200 bills that we're tracking right now. And most of those address fiscal matters. Then we also have one that's just committed just to education funding, or not just education, higher ed and K-12 generally. And this is a look at the bills that we have on education that have passed. There's been 32 bills that we've identified so far in 21 states. And then, so feel free to use this as a resource. And also I have resources on what the revenues look like in the last recession. And I mentioned this in our previous call, but this is online, and feel free to access that and for reference. And that finally, then here's links to those other resources and I'll send this PowerPoint out to everyone after the meeting. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of these, and then also, of course, the resources of the Learning Policy Institute, and Jason mentioned that we'll be working on these series of briefs with WestEd on the education in a time of a recession. So I'm going to stop talking and I'll leave it to anyone from Montana or Wisconsin if you'd like to make any comments or have any questions.
Yeah, I can weigh in just quickly. We had a legislative update on finance on Tuesday. We're looking at next year being down 12% on revenue, so that's going to impact how we look at things. The good news is for Montana is we have a very good financial position going into this. We don't know that at this point. The best guess is we won't have to go past what the reserves are, because we had a special reserve budget set up, but it's really early. Nobody is absolutely guaranteeing any of those numbers, but it was a fairly decent outlook.
That's good. Yeah, one thing that's stunning about this pandemic is just how much we don't know from one week to the next. It just seems to change. It's hard to really predict what's going to happen from one week to the next.
Okay, can I add one more thing? We're a property tax, income tax state. We have no sales tax. Property taxes fund education. A lot of that's local, depending on, so there's some shuffling going to go on there. The state budget itself is income tax for a lot of other things. So kind of two different pots.
Yeah, interesting. Alicia, I know you're on the line. Do you want to, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to share anything on what you're seeing in Wisconsin, we'd love to hear it too. All right. Well, that gets us to the top of the hour, and thank you everyone for joining us. Let's see. We'll post this online, and we'll send out the link to this recording and also to the presentations that we had earlier. Oh, and it looks like Alicia's saying her mic is not working. So we'll catch you next time. Alicia. Well, thank you everyone, and have a great day and a great week.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good to see everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.